So I enjoyed your Money Printer Go Burr website.
Yes. Money printer go Burr, is it .com or
.com.
.com? And Burr has three R's. And take note, there's a slider hidden at the bottom of the screen that you might miss.
Yeah, I slid it. It's great. So I feel like if I crank this slider all the way up, it's still about an order of magnitude too slow for the real rate.
Oh, it's certainly too slow. Also, the Fed has just been like, we'll release things in unlimited amounts as necessary. So,
So can you tell me about the macroeconomic effect of this happening? So I should say, like, we talk about economic stuff and like stock stuff once in a while. And sometimes I feel like I'm just sort of nodding along. And you're like, with interest rates like this, the Fed's going to blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, I don't really understand what the interest rate does to things. And I feel like a lot of people understand that better, or they're all just nodding their heads also. And so if the Fed's going to like print, I know it's not exactly like that, but they print a bunch of money, what is going to happen besides dollars are worth less?
yeah, I think part of the problem is that there's so much conspiracy theory around the Fed that having a serious discussion about the nuts and bolts of how it works will always get bogged down when you do it online.
Speaking of nuts, I had a coworker who insisted that every president that had ever tried to get rid of the Fed had been assassinated or there were attempts. And he basically drew a circle around, I think it included Lincoln, but it was like Lincoln, McKinley, Garfield, JFK, and then like Reagan's assassination attempt and like a couple of other presidents. And it was like all of them were because the Fed does two things: it prints money and it assassinates presidents who try to stop it. He believed this.
Fails like half the time.
Yeah, like when they failed to assassinate Reagan, I guess he backed off because he knew that the bullet came from the Fed or some. I
I
don't know
thought
what
the
the excuse was.
conspiracy theory was that, well, I guess it would be a related conspiracy theory. I thought it was that it was presidents who like wanted to go back to the gold standard or something like
Maybe,
that. I guess that is related though, because if you had a gold standard,
but JFK and before were still gold standard, right?
yeah, I guess it was like during the Nixon era that we finally got completely off the gold standard.
Yeah, it was a very complicated and confusing conspiracy theory, but that didn't.
Yeah, and so that goes into the problem of even discussing conspiracy theories, because 10 years ago, anything that was a conspiracy theory was considered absolute quackery, right? And then finally, Edward Snowden was like, no, really, your government is spying on you and recording all the stuff you do on the internet. And so then it was like, all those crazy conspiracy theory people, they were right. And it's like, what else might they be right about? And so now we have to take a different view of things we classify as conspiracy theories. Maybe we should pay a little more attention and think a little more critically before we rule them out. Don't rule them out of hand simply because they are a conspiracy theory.
I'm surprised you feel that way about Snowden. So I was saying the Snowden stuff to people for a long time. I guess maybe people were dismissing me as being crazy because there were a lot of things that were publicly known where it was like the NSA requested to tap, such and such fiber line running through AT&T in this specific room, and this guy talked about it. And there were programs like Carnivore where it was like, oh, we want to sweep up all the email in the US. And that was just the FBI. It wasn't even the NSA. And also, people didn't even know what the NSA did. And it was like the NSA's charter is like signals intelligence. It's to spy on signals. So, like, why wouldn't they try and spy on very easily accessible signals? And I felt like I wasn't even giving anything that was really out there. It was like, yeah, tapping a fiber optic cable seems like a really good idea. And then the Snowden stuff came out. Like, when I heard about Prism, I didn't realize it was part of a larger pattern of leaks from this one guy. And it was like, oh, Prism exposes this huge surveillance program. And I looked at it and I was like, yeah, I mean, I figured that was always happening. I didn't care when that first revelation happened because I was just like, yeah, now it's just public. Okay. But then more and more were dropping. And I was like, oh, okay, I see it's part of this larger pattern. But I was just like, yeah, of course.
Yeah, but I think the distinction is that stuff was, some of it was publicly known, but it wasn't widely known.
Okay, maybe
And
so.
Snowden popularized it.
Because also, like, I've been involved in, like, from an amateur slash fan level in crypto for a long time. And so I know that the NSA has had its hands in that for a really long time. When the internet came out, when they were like developing standards like IP, the NSA would always show up and they'd always have a guy there. And the guy would always be like, there can be no encryption and like don't encrypt anything. And they're like, oh, why? And they're like, oh, it'll add overhead. It'll make it harder for things in the middle to understand and route packets. And also just, for national security, we don't want our enemies to be encrypting everything. So it should just be an open internet where everyone can see everything. Don't encrypt it. And then when they made DES, there's a whole thing around that. Anyway, I would love to do like an encryption podcast, even though a lot of it's hard to explain if you can't see it. But like the NSA has been involved in all of that stuff. And they've sort of alternated between trying to make things more secure and trying to make things less secure, whoever's in charge at the time or whatever team you happen to engage at NSA. And so I knew that they had cared for a really long time. And also, if you're the NSA and you're like, I want DES, like the encryption standard everyone's going to use, to have 56-bit encryption. Don't go to 128. Like, what does that imply?
That they can break 56 and they can't break 128.
And it implies one other thing. It's that they're going to be intercepting 56-bit all the time. That's the important part. So, because like they both need to be able to break the encryption, but they need the encrypted message. So how are they going to be getting that? And it implies this wide-scale surveillance that you don't know about, but they must be intercepting a lot of traffic that they expect to be encrypted. Also, however much traffic they're intercepting at the time they request 56-bit and no more, they're going to be intercepting more in the future. Like the surveillance program's never going to go backwards. It's always going to surveil more, and it's going to store more, and it's going to be able to filter over more. And so that implies, even at the time they were doing that, some kind of surveillance program that is intercepting a lot of traffic that they know will go dark, basically, because of this encryption. And so, yeah, it implies they can break 56-bit and that they're scooping up a lot of it. And that was, I can't remember what year that was.
2013, I think.
No, for DES, it was like 78 or something.
This certainly isn't going to help our Google rankings when we're already a podcast apparently very popular with conspiracy theory people.
I think they're just the ones who leave comments on YouTube.
I hope so.
It was 77. Yeah. So in 77, they're like, we're intercepting traffic that we think will be encrypted. And also we want to pave the way for decrypting in the future. And so that tells you a lot. So I didn't find that stuff surprising. Also, when Snowden happened, I worked at Google. And so I would talk to like sysadmins. We actually had sysadmins at that time. And then there are also SREs. And I would talk to them about the various things they did to secure Google hardware against attacks. And like one of the threats was the NSA. I'm sure that's no surprise to anyone. It's like you want to defend against the strongest actor that you think you might be able to defend against. And we would start going into potential attacks that they could do. It wasn't that surprising to hear about the Snowden stuff, but it was surprising to everybody else, I guess. But I feel like there's got to be like a simple conspiracy theory out there. I just can't, like, faking the moon landings is a good example. So that one would have been simple to execute initially. It would have been a lot easier than actually landing people on the moon, but keeping it secret would have been impossible.
Yeah. And making it hold up for decades would have been really hard.
Yeah, it would have.
Now that you have like amateur level astronomy equipment that can see the stuff we left behind on the moon.
Yeah, it would have been like you'd supposedly land people on the moon, and then you'd have a series of tragic accidents that killed thousands or tens of thousands of NASA employees because it's the only way you could keep them all quiet. And that's basically what it would have taken.
There was a movie, I think, in the 1980s with O.J. Simpson in it where they faked a Mars landing. Yeah.
So I've read about that. It sounds like the moon landing conspiracies didn't really show up until that movie. Well, until the book came out, I think. There was a book too. And then the movie. And yeah, they faked a Mars landing. And the thing was, it was kind of sad. So spoilers for anyone who cares about Capricorn 1. But they built the hardware to be able to do an actual Mars landing, but they couldn't build the life support to be able to make it long enough. And so they had a rocket that could like go there and come back and then like eject the craft out. And so what they were going to do was have they were going to send the rocket up, but with no people in it. And then they were just going to have the astronauts like held prisoner for a couple months while it supposedly did this Mars mission. And then what happened was the rocket like blew up on the launch pad. And so then everyone thought that the astronauts were dead. And the astronauts were like, oh shit, they're going to kill us to keep this a secret. And so then the astronauts escape. And I think one of them dramatically shows up at his own funeral or something like that. But they have to like escape through the desert. And Which also I thought was pretty funny because it's like, of all the people that you would think could escape and get away, like astronauts are really good candidates because they select them for being like the toughest, most inventive people. And it's like, yeah, they would be tough. And then that happened, and then there were moon conspiracy theories all of a sudden because everyone was like, oh, I have a brilliant idea that I just now came up with. What if they faked the moon landing? I remember encountering a conspiracy theory when I watched Sneakers as a kid. And there's one character who's like, that's how they faked the moon landing. So it was all a soundstage. And then I asked my dad, and I think he like paused it. And I was like, do people really think that the moon landing didn't happen? And he's like, yeah, they really do. And I was like, what? It like really bothered me as a kid.
Why are they so stupid?
Well, it's not that they're stupid. It's that they're ignorant. And why are we so sure the moon landing happened? And I wish my dad had asked me that. Like, that's what I would ask my kid if we were going to talk about it. I'd be like, why do we think that it happened? And why might it not have happened? Because you're not stupid for believing one way or the other. It's after you hear all the evidence, if you still think it was fake, now you're stupid because you're going against the bulk of the evidence. And so you're not integrating evidence correctly. But if you grew up and your parents just told you, well, yeah, it's fake. And you're like, but what about this thing? And then, they give you the mountain of evidence that conspiracy theorists have, because there's like 50 arguments or whatever that they'll throw out. Like, oh, you can't see the stars in any of the photos. Oh, the shadows are wrong. Oh, this thing. And so like there's a lot of supposed evidence in favor of it was fake. And so if someone just gives you all that and they tell you it's fake, you wouldn't be stupid for believing that. You just wouldn't know about the rest of the stuff, right? And then you go to college and you'd be like, yeah, the moon landings were faked. And your professors would be like, what the hell, man? And that would be your first experience with that. So like it's understandable for someone to have a wrong belief like that. I feel like we see that a lot with modern global pandemics where people believe a lot of ridiculous things. Oh, yeah. Also, we are way off topic, and I was originally asking you about the Fed and interest rates. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was explaining how it's hard to talk about it because of conspiracy nutters.
Because people just derail your whole conversation with conspiracy theories.
I've done it now. I've called them conspiracy nutters.
Oh, but they are.
Okay, so what was your question? Like, how does this work? Or
so if the Fed prints money, I mean, they're not really printing money, right? They give a maybe zero interest loan to an institution, but that money sort of comes out of nowhere.
Or they buy government bonds issued by the Treasury.
Yeah. So that devalues the dollar. And so that one's simple. I could explain that. Like if you have $1 trillion out there circulating, and then someone is like, surprise, I have made $0.2 trillion out of thin air. The dollar you hold in your pocket is now suddenly worth less because there's these other dollars competing to buy the same goods that it could buy. And so basically it's lost. I should have picked a better number.
16%.
Yeah, I know. It's lost 16% of its value. So I understand that. But what else happens?
You mean what else happens when the Fed like makes a bunch of new money?
Yeah, because I figure there must be effects like that money is not, well, like it's not evenly distributed to everyone. It would go into particular places and then it has to filter through the rest of the economy. And so I imagine the unevenness of how that money moves around would affect things.
Yeah, so one of those paths is going to be when the Fed buys US government bonds. Then the money goes to the government, which then ultimately gives it to whoever lobbied the government hardest to get that money made and spent on something.
What does buying a US government bond mean? I thought like I could go buy a bond and then they would pay me interest on it.
Right. So the Congress will pass a law that says we're going to spend some money on this thing. Okay. And so then that in part empowers the Treasury Department to issue a bond if the government does not have the money on hand to do it, which of course it doesn't. And so the Treasury Department issues a bond and it says, hey, I have this bond. I'm going to pay 0% interest. Who wants to buy it? And so, all the rational people say, well, you're valuing the time value of money at zero. So I think I will decline to buy that right now. And then the Fed steps in and says, you know what, I'll buy that because I am the sole group with authority to create new currency in the US. And so they create some new currency digitally, usually, unless they're like actually rolling the machine and making it go burr. And they take that new digital currency that they've printed and they give it to the government, and the government gives them ownership of that bond, and then the Fed holds it.
So is this like a more complicated way of Congress just saying, "Hey, can you just make $1 trillion from nowhere, or we can make a trillion from nowhere and spend it on this thing"?
Effectively, yeah, and
Okay.
so like when you think what are the consequences of this? Like you said, if you had $1 trillion in circulation and then you printed another 0.2 trillion via the Fed doing this, it effectively it's Congress spending money, and they're paying for it by subtly taxing your money by devaluing it.
Well, all holders of dollars.
Yes, holders of dollars. And that's the important thing, because people will be like, oh, this is going to be all this inflation and, all these bad things will happen. And, the claims of that are kind of like the validity of those claims are typically kind of mixed, I think. Um,
Why? Sorry to get off topic, but
well, I
is
mean,
it because currencies compete with each other, and so you could just hold other currencies instead?
currencies compete, but I think other central banks are also printing money as fast as they can right now, because they're all facing their own like COVID-19 crisis where they need to spend a bunch of money to like prop up economies.
You can hold bitcoins.
Yeah, you can.
Literally, this is actually a rare case where it's like, this is not meant to be entirely a joking suggestion. As much as I have some Bitcoin, but I also sort of treat it like a joke sometimes. But it is very much inflation proof. Nobody can just print more of it.
Yeah. So you can also just hold stocks or real estate or business ownership or
Well, stocks are tricky because they're valued in dollars.
right. But if you have very large inflation, their value measured in dollars goes up. And so to some extent, they're inflation protected. Now, if you have very high inflation, the underlying business that that stock represents ownership of is going to have some kind of problem.
Does the stock's value always go up that in a way that matches inflation though?
Yeah, and that's why I said it's somewhat inflation protected.
Okay.
Because you'll have all kinds of complicated problems. I mean, you can imagine like we always talk about, if with Tesla, right? If you have a really high inflation environment, that might hurt Tesla a lot, because people are going to feel poorer, and so they're less likely to buy a luxury car. If you have a high inflation environment, maybe consumer staples will do okay because people still need to eat and buy. Well, they don't need to buy diapers. That would be a bad example. You could just reuse cloth diapers, like if you had really high inflation. But
You say just, but reusing cloth diapers would suck.
yeah, it would.
For anyone who's like maybe not yet a parent or about to be a parent, diapers now are awesome. And you're going to use some diapers and your parents are going to see how they work and they're going to be so jealous because now diapers they'll hold like, a month worth of poop or whatever. and and they don't leak and they're just really great. My parents just constantly went on and on about like, "Oh my god, these diapers are amazing now. You have such great diaper technology." Here in
And
the
they cost
future,
fractions of a dollar.
yeah, don't use cloth diapers.
But you could.
You could, I guess.
And so that's why I say like the effect of high inflation would not be even over all stocks.
Also, for you gave Tesla as an example, but Tesla has a lot of debt. And if you're holding a lot of debt, inflation's really good for you, right? Because then you pay back with inflated dollars that are worth less. Like the numeric value of your debt stays the same, but the actual value of the debt goes down, like the value you owe.
A hyperinflationary scenario is just a debt jubilee.
Yeah, yeah. If you get like 1,000% inflation, it's sort of like debt forgiveness everywhere, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's another really good example of how like it's totally uneven, even within one business or within one stock. Because Tesla would be helped by their debt being devalued, but they would be hurt a lot by consumers who suddenly were poorer and felt poorer.
Okay. So far it's sounding like there weren't a lot of aspects of this that I didn't get. Is that true?
Yeah, I think there's some more complicated stuff that goes on with like
Okay.
bank lending and like banks holding money at the Fed, because the Fed is just a bank too, right? Except it also has the power to create US currency. And so there's some things like that where the prime rate comes in, and that's a bit more complicated. I don't claim to fully understand that.
Okay.
because you get into things like the overnight lending and those kind of rates, and like the Fed will backstop that sometimes if there's not enough liquidity in the overnight lending market. And I'm just a stupid engineer, so
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I feel like that stuff gets it's difficult to understand. And then one of the problems is unless you're involved in the industry, there's nothing to really anchor it to help you remember. And so you'll read about it and then you have to just sort of remember these abstract money concepts and but with no practical application. And that makes it really difficult. Because I know I'll read about this stuff. Actually, even stuff like how does a 401k work or a Roth IRA or whatever. Like I think there's a couple of those different investment vehicles and I'll have to read about them in order to make decisions on them. Like whenever I start a new company or something. And then I'm like I'm just going to learn enough to be able to select the right radio buttons and fill out the right dollar amounts. And then it just all flies out of my head the next day. And someone's like, "Oh, did you get a Roth IRA or whatever?" And I'm like, "I don't know. I made the right decision, whatever it was, but I don't remember what it was or why it was the right decision." And then I have to go learn it again later. And it's like painfully boring too. It's very uninteresting to learn about, and so it's really hard to remember because it's like it hurts to try and remember it, which is weird. I love learning about all these other things that have no practical purpose. Like who cares about the history of DES or something? But I think it's really interesting and I love learning about it, but not Roth IRAs.
so then you'll have people who would be like, the Fed is a giant conspiracy to devalue money so that like assets can then be bought up and funneled to the richest people. And I've seen variations of this conspiracy where the Fed will like devalue the money by printing a bunch, and then they'll take lots of money out of circulation in order to cause deflation. And then like the goal, I guess, would be to cause these expansions and contractions on smaller and smaller time scales. And then I guess that's just supposed to somehow make everybody like really poor and financially vulnerable. And then it concentrates wealth.
Well, okay, just
I know that's one
doing
of the
these
conspiracy theories that goes around, but
yeah, it's like probably wrong, but just doing these cycles wouldn't cause that. But if all of these like elites had inside information, then it would benefit them a lot, right? Although I don't know how much sign there is that they do. I guess some people could argue, well, they're really wealthy, right? That's how you know. But
also it seems contradictory to just observations of what like the Fed chairman Jerome Powell has been doing for the last couple of years. Because he seems like he was trying to get interest rates up a little bit. He raised several times in like 2017, I think. And he was trying to kind of get back to the point where the Fed would have some ammunition to use if we got into trouble. Because typically you lower interest rates so that more money gets lent around and you can kind of indulge in stupider ideas as a business because money is cheaper. And that's generally helpful when you're in an economic crisis. You want to like shove money out there for businesses to have access to. And then when the economy is going really strong, you can raise the interest rate a little bit to kind of rein in bad behavior. Because when the economy is strong and interest rates are still low, companies will keep making dumb decisions. And eventually, enough companies will make enough dumb decisions that the economy will start to slow down. And if you can kind of pump the brakes by raising the interest rate a little, if you're the Fed, then you kind of keep the good times going a little healthier, a little longer. And so that's what Jerome Powell had started doing. And I think it was 2017. There were 2 or 3 or 4 interest rate raises. And so it kind of says, hey, we're in this really good economic period, but we don't want people to start getting stupid with their money and taking loans just for corporate buybacks and dumb stuff like that. And so, like, he was trying to get a little bit of a grasp on it. And then COVID happened, and it was like, I guess we'll just lower the interest rate to zero immediately because this shit really is hitting the fan.
yeah. Is I feel like that asks a lot though of the Fed. Like, oh, can you predict how the economy is going to go? And I guess you do have this one lever that you can move that no one else can move that'll mess with the economy. So you can be like, well, I don't just predict it. I also cause the economy to do certain things. But I wonder like can you beat the economy like being stupid?
No, and
Okay.
ultimately, whether or not they could, and maybe someone could argue that they could. Okay, I would entertain the argument, but I think no matter what, the price of money should be set by the market.
It does seem that way.
What?
It does seem that way.
Yeah. So instead, having these guys at the Federal Reserve be like, let's vote internally on what we think the interest rate should be and how big the money supply should be seems dangerously arrogant.
But also, I feel like one of the problems that we run into with stuff is there's like these two competing factions where there's like sort of unrestricted free market capitalism, which I'll go ahead and say I'm much more aligned with that side. And then there's the side of like we can't have that. I don't know a good way to explain that side, but it's the kind of people who are like anti-price gouging, anti-hoarding. You shouldn't be able to short stocks. I think maybe index funds should be illegal. Not everyone should be allowed to invest. There should be like accredited investors or whatever. And there's
CEO pay should be capped.
sure, yeah, basically all these people who are in favor of putting restrictions on what other people can do with their money. Basically, they're like, I don't want people to be able to just do whatever they want. And I feel like those things mess with each other a lot because a lot of problems, like you would say, oh, let's let the market set the price of money. But then there's a lot of restrictions around what you can actually do. Like you can't just invest arbitrarily. Like I can't, like if I say, oh, I think WeWork, like, when coronavirus started, if I say, I think WeWork is going to do terribly because of this, which I mean, I did, I can't go short it. There's like 2 or 3 laws that are standing in my way from being able to do that because it's like they're privately held. So you can't trade against them. You can't short them. I'm not allowed to. I'm not an accredited investor. Like I can't go make a financial instrument to do this. Like I could say, hey, Craig, I bet you that WeWork is going to tank. And like there's no legal way for me to offer you that bet or other people. And there's all these restrictions. And so then it's like, it's up to somebody else. And when you can't short stuff, you can't price it accurately. I don't know if you can short dollars,
Yeah, I guess in a Forex market, you could.
but if I think all the currencies are going to inflate, then I don't know. What do I do?
You go into stocks or you go into commodities or real estate or something else. You just stay out of cash.
Okay. Although all those are valued in, currency units.
That's okay. That doesn't mean anything. That doesn't give you risk based on the currency.
I guess really what you do is you take out a bunch of debt, right? Because
Well, sure. That yeah, that would be kind of like the short selling type of move.
you're like, I'll just borrow $100 million from, I
Yeah,
don't know, someone.
you you're essentially borrowing the dollars and giving them away for something, trading them away for something, and then you'll get those dollars back somehow else in the future and repay them when they're worth less. So I guess like taking huge loans in anticipation of high inflation is short selling dollars. It's one of those really subtle things.
Yeah, probably the loan itself, what you do with the principal, the interest rate, that ends up mattering a lot more than the inflation, unless you correctly predict hyperinflation or something, but then you have other problems.
Yeah.
So you've been watching your coronavirus White House briefings, right?
I think I watched last like Monday or something.
Has anything interesting happened on those?
I don't know.
Have you heard the Trump quote about disinfectant and injecting it?
I saw headlines about it. And so I would see headlines that are like, Trump says you should inject Lysol. And then I would see headlines that are like,
He did not say that.
media says Trump said to inject Lysol. And then I even saw one thing that was, it was a clip on MSNBC's YouTube page. And it was like, here it is, here's the video. And it's, it's him saying like 2 or 3 sentences. And then I was like, that's really unsatisfying. I would have liked to have seen the question that led to that or the entire exchange, like completely in context, but I haven't gone and looked that up yet. I probably would have to just find it within the State Department's YouTube page and their video of the event.
I don't have the question. I went and looked up the quote. He said, I see the disinfectant where it knocks it out in a minute, 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that by injection inside or almost a cleaning? Because you see it gets in the lungs and it does a tremendous number on the lungs. So it'd be interesting to check that. So supposing we hit the body with a tremendous, whether it's ultraviolet or just very powerful light, And I think you said that it hasn't been checked, but you're going to test it. And then I said, supposing you brought the light inside the body. So I feel like this is not something I would ever say.
I agree, but our backgrounds are science and engineering. And so, like, we would probably have this idea. We'd be like, I wonder if you could just like inject something or like do some kind of light treatment. And then we would probably think for a second, and either we'd come up with a reason why it's dumb, or we would come up with some like other analogous thing we're semi familiar with, and we'd go off and start Googling it.
Would you hypothesize about it on camera in front of the country?
Well, I wouldn't, but again, my background is science and engineering. So, no.
So I was talking to someone before about Trump, and then I mentioned the thing where he said he was talking about the Revolutionary War and how the Revolutionary Army bravely defended the nation's airports. And yeah, he did say that. And so someone was like, "Oh, well, he made a mistake." And I feel like I would never make this mistake. Maybe, isn't he like 74 years old, something like that?
Yeah.
I'm not 74. I don't know. Maybe 74-year-old Blake will make these mistakes. I do know other people who are in their 70s and they don't. But I feel like this is the sort of thing that goes beyond mistake and into the realm of, well, that's just an insane thing to say. I don't know why anyone would configure those words together ever in a way that's like excusable as this person's smart, they're thinking correctly, but oops, they talked about airports and the Revolutionary War together.
Yeah.
And same thing for, oh, let's inject some disinfectant or maybe put ultraviolet light inside your body somehow. What causes someone to ever say that string of words together?
Because they're not informed about anything like that. And they're thinking out loud off the cuff.
I also think it's amusing because I'm guessing you've heard Trump say that he actually knows quite a lot about this, and people are surprised at how much he knows.
About what subject?
Coronavirus.
Okay.
Which he also said you could call it a germ, you could call it flu, you could call it a virus. Nobody's even sure what it is. He also said that later after he was saying that people were surprised at how much he knows. I feel like you could argue that how much he knows is in fact surprising, except that it's sort of surprisingly little. You would hope that he would know more because he has experts advising him, and you would hope he would retain some of that, but it is a little surprising that he doesn't seem to retain any. He doesn't seem to be able to reason about it very well. Like this, if anything, this should be more important to him than it is to us. And a lot of us have done a lot of reading on it. Like, we're really interested. We're like, oh, what are the odds of a vaccine showing up? And what would happen then? And what's a coronavirus exactly? Let's go look that up. And you would think that he'd have people like telling him all day, like, okay, let's whiteboard this out. Here's what the little spiky things are, or whatever. Mm-hmm. Could have someone explain any topic to him, whereas we have to go to Wikipedia or whatever. And so it is surprising that he can say stuff where you're just like, nuh-uh, right after he says it. That shouldn't really be happening. You'd expect him to go up in front of the nation and be just like laying down facts. And you'd be like, damn, this guy knows so much because he has the world's top experts advising him. And he's reading from a teleprompter. So it's shocking that he performs so badly. I guess I'm not shocked at this point. But when I first started hearing Trump stuff after dodging him for like 4 years, I was a little shocked.
Does it seem worse to us because you and I understand the difference between a virus and a bacteria, but probably 95% of the country doesn't?
So I feel like you're actually thinking about that starting from a presumption of like too much knowledge. I don't know that he knows that there is like bacteria and virus, because the thing is, he's like, you could call it a virus. I don't know I don't think anyone knows what it is, but it's called coronavirus. You don't have to know that there exists this other thing like bacteria or flu or germs. You don't even have to know that those things exist. It's just like what if someone said, oh, it's actually a type of corona, yes or no? Like, he should be able to guess that it is because it's in the word that is in the name. And, they could say, is it a type of corona? And he's like, yeah. And it's like, oh, okay. He's kind of ignorant. He guessed wrong. But if someone's like, is it a type of virus? He should be able to get this question right. Right?
Yeah, I guess even assuming that he doesn't understand that there is a distinction between viruses and anything else.
Yeah. And so I'm sort of left with like, well, how could anyone say this string of words? How would anyone say, maybe it's a virus? I don't think anyone knows what it is. Maybe coronavirus is a virus. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's some other thing that has virus in the name, but it's not that.
Maybe it's some other thing that we've fully mapped the genome of and understand all the information that went into it.
Yeah. Anyway, that's enough of Blake being disappointed with Trump corner, I guess. But I'm just sort of like, really? Why didn't he just say, you know what, someone else is going to handle this? Because obviously I don't know what I'm doing. And also, like, in all you've ever seen Trump talk about or anything, does he ever say, like, I don't know?
Well, no, then that's part of his personality. He never admits that he was wrong and he never apologizes. And you know what? Actually, I have seen him say, I don't know. Watching the press conferences, he does answer that. Sometimes one of the journalists will ask him some question and he will say, yeah, I haven't heard about that. I'll check on that and get back to you. So yeah, he does say that from time to time. So that is distinct from this other part of his personality where he never apologizes or admits he was wrong.
Yeah, I don't know. If never apologizing seems like okay, I guess. I feel like if you're a politician, probably you should, but also he's kind of not. Like, he kind of came from business and he was able to win the presidency without having to do a lot of political stuff. And so he can, I mean, even if you're in politics, you're not really obligated to act like a politician. He doesn't really have to. He's already president. But it seems like apologizing is a useful strategic move. It seems like it would be bad to, like, once in a while presidents are like, we're considering all options, including nuclear. And it's like, yeah, it's good to be able to say, like, I have all the strategies available to me. And so if you're like, I never apologize, you're sort of just throwing away a strategy for no gain, right? But it's okay. But then never saying that you don't know seems kind of stupid. It's like, you can't know everything. And that's okay. You're like, hey, I have all these other people. That's part of what I do. I'm the president. I can tell like tons of people to do tons of stuff. I can get them to all tell me information.
There was a question last week, or the week before, and it was something to do with the Paycheck Protection Plan and the Small Business Administration loans. And one of the journalists said something like, apparently the law had been written in a way that felons who owned businesses could not get these loans.
That seems crappy.
But then, like, also people with lesser types of convictions who own businesses also couldn't get the loans. And she was like, have you heard about that? And he was surprised. And he was like, no, I didn't know that. We'll check into it and see what we can do about fixing that.
Do you know any more about that?
No.
Oh, because I was going to ask if it was like felons were excluded because of other laws that are negative on felons, or if it was written into the text of this law where it was like, and P.S., no money for felons.
The way the question was asked led me to believe that it was written into this.
That seems really shitty.
Yeah.
Because like a felon needs, I mean, the law argues, I guess, by its very existence, that there are all these citizens of the US that need some money from the government. And I don't think that felons have different needs around money.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's not like felons are corona proof, and it's not like their businesses will succeed where others will fail, because they're scrappy felons and, they survived a year on the inside. So they must know, like, that's just really crappy. I don't know why anyone would write that in excluding them. Maybe they're like, we're worried that they'll commit a bunch of fraud around it, except probably it excludes all felons.
There was probably just a ton of text that was hanging around that was cut and pasted into the law.
That's a good argument. Yeah. So really, no one excluded the felons. They just got excluded. Someone's going to have to go back and like patch the law. I would believe that. And that's like the charitable interpretation. Like, no one was out to get them. It's just that no one was out to help them until this journalist raised the question. I feel like that's the simple explanation too. So people who listened to our previous, 2 episodes ago podcast might remember I mentioned reading something. I've only read one thing about Japan, but I was like, I predict Japan will get smashed. So some news came out about that. So the thing I had read was it was sort of like a concerned citizen talking about Japan. And maybe a lot of our listeners will know what I'm talking about here. But it was this blog post: Japan will face rapid acceleration of COVID-19 in April, leading to a public health crisis. And then it was just this long document with a lot of sort of assertions supported by some facts, and the document itself admitting that it's kind of guesswork. And it was just like, I think due to cultural reasons and political reasons, Japan's way under testing. Their strategy is bad. The outbreak is probably already a lot more rampant than they realize due to these factors, and their ability to control it's going to be really poor, and they're really late to responding. And it was not clear who wrote this. It's obviously a native English speaker, but someone who has a deep knowledge of Japan. And then it was sort of like, is this like a medical researcher? It's written like almost like an academic paper, but not quite. And I feel like if I had tried really hard to guess about who wrote it, I might have been able to. But it turned out that it was Patrick McKenzie working with 3 other people that I think he hasn't named yet. And he finally revealed, like, yes, it was me all along. So Patrick McKenzie is a software engineer who lives in Japan. He posted to Hacker News a whole lot a couple of years ago. He's mentioned he had some job where he would have to kick off build jobs, and then he'd have to wait for like 10 minutes for them to complete. And so then he'd go browse Hacker News and comment. And so for a couple of years, he was one of the most prolific commenters on Hacker News. You would just always see this Patio 11 comment at the top of anything, and it was him. And he's written a lot of blog posts where he gives a lot of information, and people really appreciate that. And so he just saw this where he was like, I think Japan's doing really badly. And then he talked to other people, and they were like, oh, I think everything's going to be fine. And he's like, what? Why would you believe that? And they're like, because, the government's saying that, and I'm not seeing any evidence that corona's everywhere or anything like that. And so he's like, okay, I have to do something. And so he wrote this thing. He published it anonymously. He got some people to sort of promote it. And it turns out that he was the source of this. And I thought that was really interesting. This is a weird thing to see. Like, somebody has this strong belief that their entire country is more at risk from a pandemic than everybody realizes, and they undertake this effort to make it known just on their own. And I don't know how often that's ever happened before, but I thought it was really novel. I read it, it got to me, and I don't even live in Japan. I don't really have a lot at stake here. I was just like, oh, I think Japan's going to get hurt really bad by this after reading it. And I still think that's probably the case. Some people asked after he published it, like, what was the point of this? Like, oh, you're just publishing this anonymously. Like, what can anyone do about it? Who's going to care? Did you just publish this so you could get the accolades afterwards? But I feel like this is the argument of, why do fire alarms exist? And one of the reasons is because when a really loud fire alarm's going off, it gives everyone the social approval to do an unusual activity and get up and walk out of the building via the stairwell. Whereas people would look around at other people not moving, and they would just sit there and wait until smoke filled the room. And so he's sort of like, okay, Japan, it's safe to do lockdowns. It's safe to say that this is a public health problem. It's safe to start testing. And from what I understand, Japan did start taking things more seriously after this got published. But I guess they would never say, oh, yeah, it's because of the thing this guy did. Do you have any thoughts about that?
But really, the accolades.
He'll get so many favorites on Twitter, so many retweets.
Yeah, I guess it's interesting. I mean, I read part of the document that he originally posted. And I don't know, it just seems like he was ultimately ineffective. I mean, you said he kind of got some people to act a little more seriously, but it's cool. And it's like he actually took his prediction, and even though it was anonymous, he put it out there. And he did it in a way that would like verify that, he could verify later that this was his prediction and he wasn't changing it after the fact. So that was kind of neat. But, I guess I question, like, if it turned out he was totally wrong, would he have made a big blog post and been like, hey, that was me and I was wrong about this, and here's the proof that it was me?
I think a lot of people guessed that it was him. There were some people who claimed it was blindingly obvious. Which,
yes, of course.
Yeah. I don't think that they wrote their own prediction and tweeted out a hash and then later revealed it. Anyway, it was blindingly obvious to them in hindsight. But I feel like if I had thought about it really hard, he's the only person I know of who has this like strong connection to Japan. And so I would have guessed, what if it was him? And then I probably would have gone and looked at his Twitter feed and I would have been like, oh, well, he tweeted hash like on the same day this went out or whatever. That's super suspicious. But that would have just sort of been because I just happened to know of him. Like the way I found it out was from the Marginal Revolution blog, which is run by Tyler Cohen. And so like there's this weird connection of I read this economist blog, therefore I found this anonymous blog post from this guy who lives in Japan that I also know of. It's not exactly a small world. It's like a relevant, tight-knit community, but it's just weird. So I don't know. Someone could have guessed. And then I guess he could have just refused to admit it ever. He'd be like, no, I tweeted those hashes for some other reason. And now they're deleted. And let's drop it. But I feel like he probably would have been like, yeah, it was me and I guessed wrong. Yeah. He seems like that kind of guy. He's also very publicly predicted that he thinks Bitcoin's going to fail and go to zero. He's predicted that for many years now. I don't know when he's going to admit that he's wrong. Or arguably he's like, well, just wait 10 more years and it'll fail. I don't know. I think he's wrong. I bet that he's wrong also.
Have you tweeted out a hash?
No, but I bought some Bitcoin. I bet very strongly that he's wrong. Although I guess he could argue it's hard to short Bitcoin. So, but he could short it now. And I think he does not. So my bet means more than his bet. So the other thing I read lately was projectevidence.github.io. It's project-evidence. And this appears to be maybe another anonymous thing. So we're just doing this now, I guess. But it's evidence SARS-CoV-2 emerged from a biological laboratory in Wuhan, China. And so I read through all this. It's incredibly long. When you load this page up, you will be daunted by this tiny, tiny scroll bar that's about the same size as the scroll up, scroll down arrows on Windows. It's so tiny. But it's a very compelling document. And I'll go ahead and summarize it. Basically, they argue that the virus that's currently the global pandemic probably existed in one of the two bioresearch facilities in Wuhan, China, and then got released from them somehow. And so they don't make any kind of assertion as to how the virus came to be exactly. They have some inferences. They also don't make any assertion about the release in particular. So I guess someone could argue, oh, they did it on purpose, although that's a weird thing to do. Like if you're China, you're like, yeah, let's start by attacking ourselves, and that's how we'll get everyone. Like, why wouldn't you just put the virus in somewhere else, put it in Russia or the US or something to start with? It seems. Yeah. So the idea that it's like a biowarfare attack by China, originated in China, is sort of weird. I guess you could go deep into conspiracy territory and be like, they're false flagging themselves. But it's like, if you have the virus, this is the stupidest possible way to release it, I think. Well, I guess no. If you're if you're saying they're false flagging yourself, then you're going to come up with some reason why this is the optimal approach for them. But
they'll recover first, and then they'll assert themselves economically over the rest of the world.
Yeah, that's not bad. Sure.
This is why we end up with so many conspiracy theorist comments on our YouTube.
Yeah. Well, also, I don't know. I think a lot of people just listen to the podcast and they're like, cool, and then they don't do anything. But it's the crazy people who are like, my voice must be heard, and then they're like, blah, 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 and they mash on the keyboard with their palms or whatever, and conspiracy garbage comes out. But I felt like this was pretty compelling. So I haven't checked their citations to confirm that the citations actually exist. So they could make them up, I guess, out of whole cloth, but that would be kind of a weird thing to do. But in general, they prove a bunch of things. The laboratories in Wuhan have worked on previous coronaviruses. They worked on previous SARS. They've researched a bunch of recent like swine viruses. And the reason that they know that is because they've published papers about it. And so they're like, here's the research we did. We worked on this. We worked on this. We wanted to test a disinfectant. So we put SARS all over, I think, like a chamber or something, and then sprayed it with disinfectant to see how long it took to go away. I feel like I would have tested with like the common cold, but nope, they sprayed SARS. I guess once you have SARS, you're like, all we have is this SARS hammer. So the whole world looks like a SARS nail. You start spraying it everywhere. You put it in your hair, use it to paint your house. You just can't get away from it. But they showed that they've done a bunch of research with this stuff, and they published it. They made it public, and also this research lab's existed since 1956. It's on Google Maps. It's not really a secret. It's like, hey, they're doing bioweapons, also bioresearch there. Bioweapons research is also not banned. You're allowed to develop even offensive weapons for the purpose of developing defenses against them. And so presumably the US, Russia are doing this. Probably a lot of countries are doing it. They're probably doing some of their efforts out in the open too, publishing papers. And so it's like not really a big deal. It's just like, hey, we research pathogens. That's our job. And it's probably a good idea that people are researching these. And so they're just like, we think that they're sort of making guesses and not trying to insinuate that this is the truth. They're just guessing, but they're like, we think that this laboratory probably got this virus from a bat somewhere and they were researching it and then had a containment failure. And there's also been a history of containment failures at other research labs, and they go into all of those. And there's been like 70 or something in the past. There's been a huge number. And so I feel like all this seems very plausible, and it's not really that finger pointy, other than these particular labs should probably upgrade their practices. Mm-hmm. And so even though this is going to get out, it's going to kill hundreds of thousands of people. It's just sort of like, oops. And I think that's reasonable. It's not like any person is to blame. It's a failing of procedures, because you can't say that it's a person's fault and just argue, oh, well, they should have been more careful. And it's like human care shouldn't enter into it. You should have a procedure where the output is success.
Yeah.
And they didn't. And so they should probably just take this as a lesson. And other research labs should too. But I thought that was really interesting, because I had sort of been like when this first happened, I was like, oh, it'd be really interesting if it was like a bio warfare thing from China, but I bet that's not the case. And then I read something else that was like, oh, it was the virus does not appear to be engineered. And after I read that, I was like, oh, okay, well, that makes it a lot less likely that it was a bioweapon. This most recent document actually cites that paper. And they're like, yeah, it doesn't look like it's engineered, but it looks like they had it there and they were researching it. And I was like, oh yeah, that's kind of a case I hadn't thought about exactly. And so it just looks like, yeah, they were screwing around with what we now know as coronavirus, and then it got out, and that's too bad. I wonder who wrote this. I'm guessing it was not Patrick McKenzie in this case.
Yeah, the initial things I had heard about that all made it seem like they were implying that it was engineered. And so then I think you linked to that document up in your Discord channel last week. And then I started reading some of it, and I was like, oh, okay, this is a lot more believable that it's not explicitly engineered. Instead, it was simply an accident.
Yeah. And so, yeah, the argument that it's not engineered is that it's known how to make a virus that does what Corona is doing more effective than it is. And like if someone were to engineer this, they would make it more effective. So that indicates that it was not engineered. And I think that's a pretty strong argument. So yeah, I think that's about all I have to say about that. So anyway, those are the interesting things that I had read recently that I wanted to cover.
So I guess if you live in Georgia, you can get your nails done and your hair done now, and you can get tattoos, something.
Yeah, it's really revealing a lot about how people are bad at making decisions.
I think in some places, it's reasonable that you can open some things and you can open them in some ways, but a nail salon, it's like, where's the benefit? Besides political.
Get your nails did.
Besides political, where's the benefit?
Well, political benefit is the most important benefit if you're a political decision maker.
Yes.
I mean, this is what I talked about earlier, where people are like, I'd rather 1 million people die than me lose re-election. This comes up all the time when people are deciding whether or not to start a war. They're like, well, it's not me out there dying, and so can I gain something? I think a lot of people don't realize that's how the world works. Like, I keep seeing a lot of people talk about politicians where they're like, they were supposed to protect the public interest. And it's like, what makes you think that? I know people repeat this meme, but like, do you think, I don't know, maybe it's written in the public constitution or in the US Constitution. Maybe it says, it does say like promote public interest or something like that, but there's not really anything in there that's like, if you don't maximize the public interest, this bad thing will happen to you. Like, it's not in there. And I don't know why people seem to think that that's what a government is for or how it works or something like that. And then they think sometimes that businesses should do that. And it's like, that's not what businesses are for either. There's some nonprofits that might have that in their charter, but it's like not anyone's job exactly. It's something that we kind of do as a side effect of other things. And I guess I kind of see how you could get there. Like, maybe your parents tell you that, then you go to school and everyone tells you that. They're like, oh, the government's here to help us. That's what they're for. And then you can point to all these things the government does, like all these programs that have care in the name. I think, didn't they just pass the CARE or CARES Act? And there's Medicare and like Medicaid. That sounds pretty aiding. Social Security, that sounds nice and secure. But also the government can just name these programs whatever they want. Department of Defense hasn't defended the US since 45, I guess.
The Patriot Act.
I mean, you can name it whatever you want. And like the government's not really obligated to help anyone. It just kind of does. That's one of it's like an accidental output. Really what it does, it centralizes force. It uses the force to collect taxes. It uses some of the taxes to pay for the force. And then it has to administrate itself because someone has to like decide who does things. And that's really the core. And then there's all this other stuff where it's like, well, we've taken all this tax money from people. What should we do to buy their favor back from them? And you give them their own money back, but in ways that will buy votes. And so I don't know. Maybe other people listen to me and they're like, man, he is crazy pessimistic about this. I don't know.
Cynical and burnt out.
Yeah, cynical is a better word, right? Yeah. And they're like, no, this is really what the government does. They really protect us. I don't know.
You are scarred over head to toe.
Yeah, and I feel like this doesn't like make me mad or sad or anything. It's just like, well, I feel like I'm just being realistic. Like, this
you're
is
acknowledging the reality. When I was younger, people would call me pessimistic all the time.
Yeah.
And I used to believe it. And then as I got older, I started to realize like, I'm not pessimistic. Like, I'm just saying, like, I'm describing the world as I see it in very objective terms. Like, I'm trying to knock off the sugarcoating as much as I can and tell people exactly how things work. But people themselves interpret that as bad because they don't want to acknowledge that, hey, the world actually works that way. And so then they call you pessimistic.
Yeah, it's like a defense mechanism.
Yeah, and over time, I would argue with people and I'd be like, I don't think I'm pessimistic. I think like cynical, definitely. But,
I've also gotten, I think I'm actually very optimistic. Once in a while, if we're talking about the right topic, people will say that to me. Like, I think humanity's pretty unlikely to wipe themselves out. And I think we'll eventually spread across the universe. And then everyone's like, well, that's wildly optimistic. And it's like, but I don't think so. Like, I can point to all these reasons why I believe that. And like, I'd bet money on it, except it's hard to make a bet about, a million years in the future. I think eventually people will become immortal through technological means. And they're like, oh, that's really optimistic. And it's like, is it? But then also similarly, I'm like, politicians are selfishly interested and don't care about people. And they're like, oh, that's cynical and pessimistic. And it's like, I feel like these are just realistic things. Like, they fit the evidence that I see.
And you're being very unemotional about your views on these things.
Yeah, like if you could just say a sentence like, you're going to die one day. And then people are like, well, that's pessimistic. And it's like, is it? I think it's like, really, there's a huge amount of cognitive dissonance involved if you somehow don't think this is the case. It's very likely that you will eventually die. Like 99+%, unless immortality gets developed right before you die. But people like don't want to think about it. So then they're like, you're pessimistic. And it's like, I'm realistic and you're, I don't know, closing your eyes to the situation. And I don't know. I guess also I feel like, so COVID is kind of a test of that. I think a lot of people felt like the people predicting exponential growth and lots of deaths they thought they were pessimistic. And they're just like, no, I mean, I can fit an exponential curve and it goes up to a really high number on the y-axis unless we do a whole lot. And people did not do a whole lot really early. And now it's really bad. And nobody's going back and saying, I'm sorry I called you pessimistic. You were right. Everyone's just like, oh, well, now we know. And it's like, you mean now you know? Other people knew before you. You just didn't want to listen. I just brought up the worldometer, and it's about 3 million cases, 206,000 deaths. Also, we're recording this on April 26th, by the way. Let's switch these graphs to logarithmic. Still looks bad. Ugh, that curve is not flat yet. Let's look at the US. Almost 1 million cases, 55,000 deaths. I remember talking to some people early on in this, and I was like, this is way worse than the flu. And they're like, but hasn't the flu killed didn't it kill 34,000 people last year? And I was like, yeah, but this will kill way more people if it progresses unchecked. And they're like, it has killed way more people than last flu season. And it hasn't been unchecked. Last flu season, for reference, was 34,000. And it's at 55K now. So, yeah. And it's still going up. the US curve's very nearly flat.
So the second derivative is negative.
The acceleration, yeah, it's
Yeah.
decelerating. Yeah. It also sucks when you're having to look for like second and third derivatives for hope.
I'll take what I could get. But I've heard we'll have a V-shaped recovery.
What's V-shaped?
It's like everything went down like this, and once we get to some event no one can exactly name, then it'll just go back up symmetrically.
Oh, if anything, it would probably go up a lot faster than it came down. It'd be worse. I'm guessing that's, we start lifting some amount of lockdown, right? And then everyone goes out and gets infected. Yeah, I think.
No. It's the optimistic, it's the excessively optimistic view that the economy has only been paused, and when we allow it to restart, it'll just go back up in, a mirror of how it came down. And it's like, man, that is way too optimistic. Like, you look at the new unemployment claims, and
that's what I was gonna say.
Yeah, and it's like
the 20% unemployed are just gonna go right back to work.
Yeah.
At their jobs that don't exist anymore in some cases.
Yeah, at the companies that in some cases are bankrupt now and don't exist to fulfill demand that isn't there.
And may never return.
Yeah, not all demand gets pent up. That's the thing.
That's a good way of putting it.
Well, it's frustrating because I see people make these arguments online and they're like, we're just building extreme pent up demand. We're allowed to, like, we'll just unpin it. And it's like, dude, nobody's going to go out to eat 40 nights in a row because they have pent up demand and they missed going out to eat.
I thought you were going to use the example of they're going to go see 8 movies a day in the theater.
I feel like theaters will have a proportion of pent up demand because the releases themselves are being held back. And so how the studios will dole out the releases slowly once theaters are allowed to reopen. And so I think you will see some pent up demand. Now the behavior will have changed and some people will just flat refuse to enter a theater for a long time. And so it won't be 100% reversal. But, another good example is car buying.
Man.
There are some people whose cars have all of a sudden worn out in these last 2 months. And right now it may be excessively burdensome to go buy a car. It's just a pain in the ass right now to do it, right? But, and so those people will represent pent up demand for new cars. But
I think very few people's cars suddenly wore out because a lot of people's cars have just been sitting for a month.
Right. So it's going to be very small. It's going
to
be.
Thanks for reminding me. I need to drive my car because I want to make sure the battery doesn't die sitting in the garage. Yeah. It will.
Yeah. And so, but to a great degree, people are going to look at their car and they're going to be like, how many more years can I get out of that? Because I'm feeling really unsure about my finances right now. And so like car buying isn't going to experience this giant symmetrical pent up demand. People aren't going to suddenly call their personal trainer and say, I need 20 sessions in a row.
I want to pay for 3 parallel gym memberships.
Yeah. So, a lot of this
for cars, it's going to be really bad because cars are selling for really cheap right now. So even when the pent up demand is released, the car prices are really low because they're trying to move them. Like dealerships have been sitting there eating costs on having cars on their lots this whole time. And there's no pent up thing that's going to fix that. Like people aren't going to go buy cars at double the prices once the lockdown lifts. They're never going to make up for that value that was lost having cars sit around not do anything.
Yeah, and people are talking about like, oh, the car factories can reopen, in some places they were ruled essential for some reason. So like they could just go to reduced work as long as they were social distancing. But, in other places, Ford is talking about we'll go back to work on May the 4th. And it's like, why? Are the dealerships around the country empty? Have you run out of inventory to sell? So I don't have answers for this. Yeah, I just get irritated when I read people being like, oh, all the demand is pent up because the economy has been paused. And it's like, no, it really hasn't. There are some cases, there are demand for some things, yes, that are pent up, but to a great degree, the demand is gone and not coming back. And again, like I said last week, I think the stock market action these last couple of weeks is wildly
Wrong.
optimistic. Yeah. I
Yeah.
don't want to say dead cat bounce, but I think bull trap is a better term. I don't like dead cat bounce, but I think bull trap is a good term. Suddenly it goes down a bunch and then it starts turning positive, and the hyper rules are like, oh man, this is the time. Everything's still kind of cheap. Let's push all in and buy every stock we can. And then after a little while, it turns back down even harder again. But
Yeah.
I think people have, by and large, I know there are specific cases for which this is not true, but by and large, people have not come to desperation and capitulation economically as a result of it.
Yeah, I agree. The like stock market indices are not as low as they should be. I'm sort of debating at this point where I'm like, how should I short this? Because it's incorrectly high right now. But I need to figure out the time frame, because I think the market, like I think, say the S&P 500 index is wrong right now. It's too high. It is not going to be this high, and I need to bet on it.
Yeah.
I'm becoming sure enough that I think I should bet dollars on it, because like 20% unemployment means it is not, things are not as good as they were 6 months ago. There will be, like, even if those people were to just return to work, there's a lot of cost associated with it that just destroys value. But it's not anywhere near that simple. And like you were saying, I would say there's a couple kinds of demand. So there's pent up demand, sure, right? There must be some of that. There's also, like, I don't know, temporal demand, where it's like I want to go to an amusement park or something like that. And if I don't go to the amusement park, like say it rains, the amusement park just loses that money. Like no one ever says, oh, there's pent up demand for amusement parks. It rained a lot, but everyone's going to come to the amusement park even harder. It's like you either go or you don't in a day. And if you can't, then that value is just lost forever, basically. That rain just like costs money, kind of destroys value. And then there's also demand that's like permanently reduced. And I think that's the thing everyone's really worried about, where people will change habits and be like, I don't have to go do this thing. I think some people will be like, yeah, I don't need movie theaters.
Yeah.
I don't really like trust them anymore. And they'll just sort of never go back. And then that's really going to hurt. And that's the thing a lot of people, I think, are trying to guess on.
I'm suddenly really apprehensive about a stranger preparing my food.
Yeah, it doesn't bother me as much. I mean,
not you, maybe, but other people.
Yeah, because like every other disease existed before this, and we were letting people prepare our food. We knew, like, the 1918 flu had already happened, right? And there's been measles, mumps, rubella, smallpox, typhoid, cholera, all kinds of scourges, and people were preparing food for other people without even knowing about hand washing a long time ago. And even now, some of us go to Taco Bell, and it's fine. So
this episode is sponsored by Taco Bueno.
That's a really regional establishment. Not everyone's going to know about that. But yeah, the demand that's going away forever, that's going to be kind of a big deal. And if work from home becomes popular, like some people think, I would bet against it. But if some companies do end up working from home, it means that everyone built too many office buildings before. And so a lot of that value will be destroyed. Like they should have been residential, or they shouldn't have spent so much money on those office buildings or whatever. And that's like a decent chunk of the real estate market. And that's going to be a many billions of dollars hit to the economy. Like the business, like the commercial real estate will still get leased out, but just not for as much money because it shouldn't have been built in the first place. I don't know. I don't have a lot of other guesses about the economy. How would you go about shorting it? I feel like it's like I could buy far dated puts.
Yeah, so you're just worried about the value decay as you sit there waiting for it to happen, the opportunity costs that you have to pay to do it. Potentially less costly way is just sell stocks now and then buy them back later when they're cheaper.
That's a good point. I do have some.
There's some opportunity cost in there because you won't ride them up to the top of what you believe is a bull trap.
That's true. Although then I have to figure out when to buy back in, and man, I hate doing crap like that. Ugh. I'll have to be like, now it's low. What's that?
Yeah, you have to time it. You have to come up with 2 decision points.
Mm-hmm.
When to get out and when to come back in.
The second one sucks. I want single decision point investing decisions.
Then buy and never sell.
That's what I was doing before.
It was so much easier.
Stonks only go up.
Green line go up.
Yeah, that's a good point though. Also, I have to figure out how will that interact with capital gains tax.
Ugh.
See,
Yeah, I know.
it's
It's like
painfully boring.
every time Bitcoin goes on a tear and I think maybe I could sell a little, and then I start looking at the taxes I pay when your cost basis is almost zero. It's like,
Mhm.
okay, well, this is gonna suck. And especially when you start looking at what if I sold some Bitcoin now? How much would it have to go back down for me to like buy back in and pocket some money? And it's like a lot. You got to get over capital gains and then transfer fees and all of that. And then actually like buy back in some more. And it's like, man, it could fall 25% or something. And basically all I would have accomplished was raising my cost basis. I wouldn't actually take any dollars out to do anything with.
You have to make a spreadsheet, and the spreadsheet has to tell you what to do. And otherwise, you're making more of an emotional decision. And then you're like, I have to make a spreadsheet.
I love making spreadsheets,
It's
man.
not about that though,
No,
right? It's terrible.
I have. I mean, I've looked at it before. Like, how much of a drop would we need, and how sure am I that it'll drop that far? Because every time it goes on a giant tear, it has like this new implicit floor to its price.
Yeah. Well, sell all your stocks and buy Bitcoin.
I think I won't be doing that.
It's not actually the worst advice. It'll be interesting to see 6-12 months from now how well has that done. Probably, I think on average, because we're talking about two instruments moving. I think stocks will go down. I think Bitcoin will go up. And so even if I'm half right, I think stocks versus Bitcoin. Like, I don't know. We should create the stocks versus Bitcoin Fungineering Index and then see how that does.
We don't start in 2010, do we?
What happens if we start in 2010?
Well, then Bitcoin clobbers stocks for eternity.
I think, yeah. I feel like that would be pretty unfair. When did Bitcoin show up? 06, 07?
Oh, I thought it was 2010. I don't know.
No, 2009. You're close.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think Bitcoin it will cover stocks forever. Yeah.
So there you go. Sell a bunch of stocks and then just place some buy orders. That's what I would do. I would just say like, okay, what's the market today? Like, take 20% off of that and set my buy order there.
And then isn't long-term capital gains 15%?
Yeah, but
So I would make 5% on my money.
No, you would make 5% on the reinvested money that was profit when you sold. All of your original cost basis, you would still get back without capital gains tax.
That's right. It's hard to think of this in terms of the gain. I always tend to think of it I think of it as like 15% off of the stock's current price.
Oh.
And instead of thinking it was the difference from the last cost basis that gets taxed, and then there would be a new cost basis now. And then when I sold it later in the future, it would be taxed based on the gain from that cost basis. And I feel like it's hard to think of it in terms of it's the delta every time. And judging from talking to other people about their RSUs at work and stuff, other people have a lot of trouble reasoning about that also. Like, they don't understand if you sell your stock immediately when it vests, there's no capital gains tax for the most part, or it might be like a couple dollars. And so because I think we're all used to thinking of sales tax, income tax, things like that.
Yeah.
All right, I've had enough.
Sell everything, hide in a bunker, and inject Lysol.